Okay, so are you ready for this one? Because today we are diving headfirst into one of the most chilling cases to ever come out of the Soviet Union, Andrei Chikatilo. And, you sent over these excerpts from his Russian Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, this is some seriously intense stuff.
Oh, it is. We're really about to unpack like the life and crimes of a man who was living a double life while committing just unspeakable acts. And I think what's even more fascinating about this case is that his arrest, which seems like this mundane event, is actually what unravels this whole web of deception around him.
I am so hooked already. Okay, so walk me through this. How does a seemingly ordinary encounter bring down one of the Soviet Union's most prolific killers?
Okay, so picture this. It's 1990, right?
Okay.
Train platform. And there's this man in a suit and tie, and he seems a little out of place. Well, that was Andrei Chikatilo. And that seemingly insignificant detail, his attire, is what caught the attention of a vigilant officer, Igor Rybakov.
Now, you'd think a serial killer on the run would be a master of disguise,
Yeah.
not somebody who is drawing attention to themselves. Like, what was he doing wandering around a train platform dressed to the nines?
Right. That's the thing about Chikatilo. He was such a study in contradictions.
Yeah.
Like meticulous in his crimes, but then careless in these other aspects of his life. And so this encounter with Rybakov was really just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay.
You see, a woman's body had been found nearby.
Yeah.
And when Chikatilo's name sort of popped up, the authorities were like, let's look into this a little bit closer.
So they had their suspicions. Okay, but what concrete evidence linked him to the murders? This is where it gets really interesting, right? Because he wasn't exactly a stranger to the police. In fact, he had participated in the investigation himself.
Exactly. He was a master manipulator,
Hmm.
blending into society, aiding the very people that were hunting him. It's
Yeah.
insane. But
Wow.
the evidence that sealed his fate was as unexpected as it was chilling an injured finger.
What?
So remember, his penultimate victim had managed to bite him during a struggle. And that bite led Chikatilo to a clinic for an x-ray.
Oh my gosh.
This seemingly innocent act, but one that would prove to be his undoing.
Wow. So even something as normal as a trip to the doctor can crack a case wide open. I have to admit, this is already painting a picture of a cunning yet oddly careless individual. But before we go any further, let's rewind a bit. The information that you sent over mentions his Russian Wikipedia page as a source. What can you tell us about Chikatilo's early life, his background? Was there anything that hinted at this darkness to come?
Yeah, that's where things get really, really interesting. So his life, especially his childhood, was marked by hardship and tragedy. Born in Ukraine in 1936, he lived through the Holodomor, which was this absolutely devastating famine that just ravaged the region. And some people speculate that this early exposure to death and even cannibalism may have had a profound psychological impact on him.
Wow, surviving a famine at such a young age has got to be a deeply traumatic experience. And, it makes you think about the long-lasting effects of these events and how they shape a person.
Absolutely. And Chikatilo himself claimed that his brother was a victim of cannibalism during the famine. Now, whether this is true or a fabrication designed to manipulate investigators is debatable, but it certainly adds another layer of complexity to his story.
It's chilling to think that, these crimes might have some sort of twisted connection to his past, but his difficult childhood doesn't end there, does it? The information mentions bullying, social awkwardness, isolation.
Yeah, you're picking up on all the key points here.
Yeah.
All of these early experiences of being ostracized, ridiculed, likely played a role in shaping his worldview. That isolation, coupled with what the source describes as sexual dysfunction from a young age, created this perfect storm, this breeding ground for resentment and twisted fantasies.
That's incredibly insightful. It seems like we're already starting to peel back the layers of his psyche a little bit. So how did this isolated, troubled young man eventually become a notorious serial killer? Was there a particular event, a trigger that set him on this path?
While it's impossible to pinpoint a single event that created the monster, his time as a teacher is particularly telling.
Okay.
He was drawn to vulnerable children, exhibiting early warning signs that sadly went unheeded. And it was during this period that he committed his first known murder, that of a young girl named Yelena Zakotnova in 1978. And this is where the cracks in the Soviet system and the limitations of the forensic science at the time really come into play.
Are you saying they had him, but then they let him go?
Not only that, but another man, Alexander Kravchenko, was wrongfully convicted of Yelena's murder.
Oh my gosh.
This misattribution was a tragic error, allowing Chikatilo to evade justice and continue his spree.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking. So how does a man like that, carrying the weight of a murder, just function. Was there any indication that he felt remorse, or did this just embolden him?
That's the chilling part, isn't it, for Chikatilo?
Yeah.
This success in evading capture seems to have solidified his dark fantasies, confirming his belief that he was above the law beyond consequence. And it was in 1982 that the true scope of his depravity began to unfold.
The information mentions this being the start of his killing spree. It's almost like that initial success, if you can even call it that, flipped a switch in him.
And the details of his crimes are incredibly disturbing. He preyed on vulnerable individuals, often young boys and girls who were lured away from train stations or bus stops. His killings were marked by extreme brutality. Multiple stabbings, often focused on the eyes and genitals, and even cannibalism.
It's hard to even imagine the terror those victims must have felt. But to the outside world, he was living this double life, seemingly normal, even participating in the search for himself. How could someone compartmentalize like that?
It speaks to a chilling level of detachment and psychopathy. He managed to construct this facade of a normal life. He was married, had children, held down a job, all while harboring these incredibly dark impulses.
It's like something out of a psychological thriller. Meanwhile, the body count is rising, the authorities are under immense pressure, and it's 1985 before we see a significant development, Operation Forest Strip. Tell me everything.
Imagine this, the largest criminal investigation in Soviet history at that point, mobilized to catch one man. They threw everything they had at it. Thousands of investigators, millions of rubles, even bringing in the military to help secure crime scenes.
That's massive. It really highlights how deeply this case shook the Soviet Union. What was their strategy? Were they just casting a wide net, or is there a more targeted approach?
It began with traditional methods, interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence, following leads. But what sets this investigation apart is the emergence of forensic psychology as a tool in their arsenal. They weren't just chasing a phantom, they were trying to understand the mind of the monster.
This was pretty groundbreaking stuff, right? I mean, we see criminal profiling all the time in shows and movies, but back then this was still relatively new territory.
Exactly. They brought in a psychiatrist named Alexander Buchanovsky, and his insights proved pivotal. He argued that the killer wasn't some crazed lunatic, as was often the popular conception. Instead, he painted a picture of a man leading a seemingly normal life, perhaps even someone overlooked by society harboring deep-seated feelings of inadequacy.
So not a monster lurking in the shadows, but someone hiding in plain sight. Terrifying. What else did this profile reveal?
Buchanovsky's analysis went beyond just a general description. He suggested the killer likely felt powerless in other areas of his life, and that the killings themselves were a way to exert control to dominate his victims.
The information mentions mutilation, particularly around the eyes and genitals. Did the profile address those aspects?
Absolutely. These details, gruesome as they are, were crucial to understanding the psychology at play. Bukovsky believed they spoke to a desire to dehumanize the victims, to exert ultimate control even in death. He even predicted that the killer might be keeping souvenirs trophies from his victims as a way to relive his crimes.
Chillingly accurate. But all of this time, Chikatilo was out there evading this massive manhunt. Did the profile's accuracy ever make them doubt themselves like they were chasing a ghost of their own making?
It's a question that has plagued investigators in many high-profile cases. But in Chikatilo's case, the profile's accuracy, while unsettling, also fueled their determination. They knew they were on the right track, that they were building a psychological portrait of a real person, not some figment of their imagination.
It's a game of cat and mouse, but on a whole other level. Did the investigation ever come close to catching him during this period?
There were close calls. In 1984, he was actually detained and questioned, but later released due to what's been described as a paradoxical secretion, essentially a discrepancy between his blood type and the semen samples collected from some crime scenes.
Wait, hold on. That doesn't make sense. How could there be a discrepancy like that?
It's a point of contention even today. Some believe it was a genuine anomaly, a biological quirk. Others speculate it was a lab error, or even a deliberate attempt to explain away his initial release.
So a potential cover-up. That just adds another layer to this already complex case. But ultimately, they let him go, and the murders continued.
Tragically, yes. And as the investigation dragged on, Chikatilo adapted, changed his tactics. In 1987, he expanded his hunting ground, venturing outside his usual territory of Rostov Oblast.
The information mentions killings in other regions, Zaporozhye, Ilovaisk, even as far as Leningrad Oblast and Moscow. He was practically commuting to commit murder.
It's a chilling example of how a serial killer can use seemingly mundane aspects of life, like work-related travel, as a cover for their crimes. Chikatilo exploited the vastness of the Soviet Union, blending and becoming a phantom, a bogeyman who haunted the railways and forests.
His crimes were becoming bolder, more brazen. Did the authorities connect the dots, realize they were dealing with the same killer across these different regions?
It took time, and sadly more lives lost. But eventually the similarities in the murders became undeniable. The brutality, the mutilations, the victim profiles, it all pointed to the same perpetrator.
But they were still no closer to catching him. What was the breaking point, the moment that finally shifted the tide of the investigation? It really is unbelievable that even with like this huge investigation and with like this scary, accurate profile, that Chikatilo could stay hidden for so long.
And it's a reminder, right, of the challenges when you're dealing with somebody this cunning.
Yeah.
It's a testament to the fact that sometimes like the best planning, the best investigations can still be outmaneuvered by pure chance human error.
Yeah.
Just the darkest parts of human behavior.
Yeah, and in Chikatilo's case, that turning point came from such a wild combination of factors. Like, we had a vigilant officer, and we had his outfit and that fateful trip to the clinic.
And we also have to remember just the role of psychology, right? Because Buchanovsky's profile, while groundbreaking, wasn't just predicting the killer's actions. It was about understanding why the motivations, the psyche.
Right.
And that understanding was so crucial when it came to breaking down Chikatilo's defenses when they finally did catch him.
Yeah, you had mentioned before that they brought Buchanovsky face-to-face with Chikatilo after the arrest. What a tense encounter that must have been. Did Chikatilo finally confess when he came face-to-face with the man who had been inside his mind?
It was like this battle of wits, like
Yeah.
psychological chess.
Oh, wow.
Chikatilo, always the manipulator, denied everything at first.
Mm-hmm.
But Buchanovsky, armed with all of his insights, was able to just chip away at that facade.
And the information you shared mentioned that he confessed to a crazy number of murders.
55.
Wow.
55 to be exact, though. Authorities were only able to conclusively link him to 53, and he was ultimately convicted of 52. But still, it's just a chilling reminder of the sheer scale of his crimes and the countless lives that were forever scarred by what he did.
And even the trial itself was this huge spectacle. This man who had been capable of such calculated cruelty now facing the consequences.
Yeah, it was a media sensation, a public reckoning with this nightmare that had gripped the Soviet Union for over a decade. Chikatilo confined to a cage in the courtroom to prevent attacks from victims' families.
Oh,
Put on this bizarre and often disturbing performance.
really?
He would go back and forth between feigning insanity, shouting at the court, even exposing himself
Oh my gosh.
in this desperate attempt to be like, oh, I'm mentally unfit to stand trial.
But the court saw through it, right? I mean, they weren't buying his act.
No, they weren't. The evidence against him was just too overwhelming. And honestly, his attempts to manipulate the proceedings only hurt him in the end.
Right.
He was judged sane, held accountable for his horrific crimes, and sentenced to death.
And even though he met his end in 1994, his case continues to fascinate and horrify and just spark debate even today. What are some of those questions, the unresolved issues that keep drawing people back to this case?
One of the biggest mysteries even now is that whole question of paradoxical secretion.
Right.
Remember that discrepancy between his blood type and the crime scene evidence?
Nah.
It's never been definitively explained.
Right.
Was it a genuine anomaly, like you said, a lab error, or something more deliberate, an attempt to throw investigators off the scent? We may never know for sure.
It really makes you wonder what else could have been missed, what other pieces of the puzzle might still be out there.
Exactly. And then there's the question of his family, his wife and children. What was it like to live with this man who for years harbored such darkness? How do they process the weight of his crimes? The knowledge that the person they knew was this monster who terrorized a nation.
That is a lot to process, and it speaks to just the ripple effect of these crimes, the trauma that extends far beyond just the immediate victims.
And we can't ever forget those victims. Their stories, their lives that were cut short are truly at the heart of this tragedy.
Yeah.
It's their memory that should motivate us to learn from this case, to understand human behavior, and to strive for a world where these horrors are never repeated.
Very well said. As we come to the end of our deep dive into the life and crimes of Andrei Chikatilo, I'm left with this profound sense of unease, but also a deeper understanding of how important vigilance is, critical thinking, empathy. To our listeners, we hope that this exploration has given you not just information, but a new lens through which to see the world. A world where monsters don't always lurk in the shadows, but sometimes they walk among us hiding in plain sight.